Welcome, everyone, to Straight Science. Straight Science is an evening seminar series put on by University of Alaska Fairbanks Northwest Campus in Nome, Alaska, and University of Alaska Fairbanks Alaska Sea Grant, also in Nome, Alaska. And tonight you're in the home office. And both Northwest Campus and Alaska Sea Grant, we are public servants of the Bering Strait region, which is the homeland and waters of the Inupiaq, St. Lawrence Island Yupik, and Central Yupik peoples. And tonight, I'm so excited because we have a presentation that really is very much Bering Strait, applicable to both sides of the Bering Strait. So the birds are as international as the Bering Strait typically is, and we're going to hear about that. And the story of the spectacled eider is very unique to the Bering Strait region, which we'll hear. And tonight's speakers are the experts for the spectacled eider on our side of the border. And we're going to hear from we're going to hear first from Dan Rizzolo, David Safine, and Erik Osnas. And David and Dan are wildlife biologists with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Alaska. And Erik is a biometrician. And I'm married to a biometrician, so that means a lot to me. A biometrician who does all the mathematics, also working for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Alaska. So with no further ado, let us know, we'll start you off with Dan Rizzolo. Let us know how our spectacled eiders are faring, given all that we've been experiencing on land, sea, and air in the Bering Strait region. We're so glad you're here. Thank you so much. And I will mention, if people can keep their videos off, except for the three speakers, that would probably be helpful, given that we've had some internet issues today. So if Magadan, if you could just thank you so much. That's super helpful. And you can turn back on at the end. With that, take it away. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Gay. And yeah, we appreciate this opportunity to share this information with you today on aerial surveys the Fish and Wildlife Service does on water birds and a focus on spectacled eiders, both on their breeding grounds and their wintering area in the Bering Sea. First, I'd like to take a minute to acknowledge the folks that helped make these surveys happen. In this is a photo from the last winter survey from March of 2023 with the survey aircraft, which is a Aero Commander operated by Clearwater Air. And in the picture are Dave Safine and Erik Osnas, who you'll meet tonight, and Dennis Marks and Tim Bowman, who are the photographers on the survey, and then Jake Craiglow and Jake Turner, who are the Clearwater Air pilots. It takes lots of other folks in administrative support, project design and planning, aerial observers, technicians who process digital images. So it's really a small army. And without them, these surveys wouldn't happen. Funding for these surveys have been provided through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Bureau of Land Management, and the University of Alaska Fairbanks Institute of Arctic Biology. So here is the main character of the talk. So here's a pair of spectacled eiders. This is a video taken by Lisa Hupp, who's a photographer for the Fish and Wildlife Service. These birds in Western Alaska are known in Yupik and Chupik as guguk. On St. Lawrence Island in Siberian Yupik, they are called Yagatalek. And in Inupiaq, they are kabasuk. And thanks for your understanding of my pronunciation there. Some of the aerial surveys we'll be talking about tonight go back to the 1950s in Western Alaska. And from that time series of data, biologists saw a really precipitous decline of spectacled eiders breeding in Western Alaska. So in 1970, the best population estimate was over 50,000 pairs. By 1992, that estimate had declined to fewer than 2,000 pairs. And based on that decline, the species was listed as threatened under the U.S. Endangered Species Act in 1993. So spectacled eiders are using tundra ponds like this only during the breeding season, which is only about May through August or September up in the Arctic. For most of the year, spectacled eiders are on the ocean, and for 3 to 4 months of that time, the ocean habitat looks like this. So this is a video taken out of the window of the survey aircraft during the winter survey. And this is south of St. Lawrence Island. Eiders arrive here in October and remain until April. The area is typically ice covered from late December through March. And the eiders are using these openings in the sea ice called leads. And they need these leads to access their food. They feed by diving to the bottom where they feed on benthic invertebrates, mostly clams. They also use the ice for roosting. They lose less heat when they roost on the ice than when they roost in the water. So if you think about this ice environment, it's very dynamic. These leads are opening and closing as the ice compresses and spreads out. These leads will freeze over during periods of calm, cold weather. And then the amount of ice changes through the course of the winter and can differ dramatically between years as well. So an interesting thing about spectacled eiders is that individuals that are spread out and nest throughout the Beringian Arctic and subarctic all come together in the winter in a relatively small area. So this map shows the range of spectacled eiders throughout the year. These light blue areas show where these birds molt their flight feathers in the late summer and fall. So in Arctic Russia, that's in the eastern Siberian Sea, and then across the Bering Strait from Nome and Mechkamensky Bay. And then in Alaska, the molting areas are Ledyard Bay, and then in Nome's backyard in Norton Sound, the eastern part of Norton Sound. The breeding range for spectacled eiders is indicated here by red. So they are in the eastern part of the Arctic of Russia. And then in Alaska, they are on the Arctic coastal plain, and then the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, which is the only subarctic breeding area for this species. So each of these three breeding areas are treated as separate populations under the Endangered Species Act. And to meet recovery, to be delisted, they all have to meet certain recovery criteria, certain recovery thresholds, which is in part what motivates these surveys to understand the status of these species, what their abundance is in each of these areas, and what the population trend is. The surveys of the breeding areas in Alaska are done every summer. In Arctic Russia, that population, which is, it spans a huge area, is not monitored as frequently. This dark blue area is the wintering area south of St. Lawrence Island. So because all three breeding populations winter together, a survey of the wintering area is essentially a survey of the global population of spectacled eiders, all of them. And that's useful because with the breeding population estimates from Alaska and a winter population estimate, we can get some understanding of the Arctic Russia breeding population. You essentially simplified it, you take the wintering population, subtract away Alaska, and what you get is the Russian breeding population. So I'll start by describing the winter survey. It's an aerial survey that uses photography. In contrast to the breeding area surveys in Alaska that are done every summer, the winter survey of the Bering Sea is done infrequently. On average, it's been done about every 8 years since the late 90s. And as you look at this picture of the frozen Bering Sea and look into the horizon, you get some sense for the scale of the Bering Sea. It's big. So to find these birds in the winter, we need some help. And we get that help from spectacled eiders carrying satellite transmitters. So in this animated map, what it's showing is locations from spectacled eiders carrying satellite transmitters. Those transmitters were deployed on birds from the breeding area on the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta and the Arctic coastal plain in the summer of 2022. And these are locations from January 1st through early March of 2023. The different colors indicate different individual birds. So the light colored area surrounding those locations is the survey area. And that survey area was based on the density of those locations prior to the survey. So those locations came first, and then based on those locations, the survey area was delineated. This survey that I'll be talking about tonight was flown between the 10th and 15th of March in 2003, over 3 days. So this figure shows the track of the survey airplane, which is the red line. It's overlaid on a satellite image of the sea ice on the day that one of the replicates of the survey was flown. And it's a transect-based survey. So each transect is spaced 7 kilometers, about 4 miles apart. And the survey protocol is for the aircraft to follow the transect. The observers in the airplane look for flocks of eiders in the ice. And when a flock is spotted, the airplane leaves the transect line, circles the flock so that photographs can be taken, and then returns to the transect line and continues on the survey looking for additional flocks. In this map, the flock locations are indicated by blue, and you can see the survey track where the survey left the transect line to circle the flock and then return to the transect line until the next flock was encountered and photographed until the entire survey area had been covered. And here's what that looks like. So this is another video out of the airplane window as the airplane approaches a flock of spectacled eiders, which is just under the propeller there. So the airplane is at 1,500 feet altitude and is moving along at 115 knots. Here it's banking as the pilot positions the airplane over the flock so that photos can be taken. Flocks like this that you're seeing here are just about always all spectacled eiders. Sometimes closer to the coast, there'll be flocks of common eiders or king eiders or long-tailed ducks, but in the ice like this, they're typically all spectacled eiders. So this is a photographic survey. So because the flocks use those discrete openings in the ice, they can be photographed sometimes in a single frame, more often across multiple frames. And a photographer here, Tim Bowman, in this photo, takes handheld oblique photographs. We also tested vertical photography along transect lines, taken from cameras mounted in the belly port of the airplane. Dennis Marks ran that effort. That approach is more useful when birds are not in sea ice but are spread out in the water, which was not the case in 2023. So how do photos get turned into numbers? Well, that work was done by a great team of technicians, Allison McCarran, Aaron McCarthy, and Lily Yunkins. They spent a winter counting eiders and photos. They counted eiders in over 200 photos, and they counted them in a way that was reproducible so that we knew every eider they counted. So this involved selecting the best photo of a flock, given the series of photos that was taken of the flock, and then pre-processing that digital image so that the eiders are visible by both cropping the photograph and adjusting the lighting so that the eiders are visible. And then they used a program to annotate the photos to indicate each eider that they saw by drawing a box around it. So with this photo of this small flock on the ice, it was cropped down to this scale to make the eiders more visible. And then in the next step, they used a program to draw boxes around every eider they counted. And here the boxes are different colors, and the colors are based on the combination of the plumage color of the bird, the background of the bird, so whether it was ice or water, and then the wing posture of the bird, so whether or not the wings were folded or spread. So in this photo, they're all on ice. The blue boxes are drawn around the white plumaged birds, which are the adult males. The pink boxes are drawn around the brown plumaged birds, which are all females and juvenile males that were hatched that year. And then in this photograph, you can see the green box here is around a bird that is mostly brown plumage, but you can see white. So this is a second year male that is molting its plumage from its juvenile brown plumage into its adult male plumage, which it'll get in its third year. So take a look at this photo and come up with a guess at how many birds you think are here, and put it in in the chat, and then we'll see if anyone gets close.
Put your best guess in the chat. There we go.
That's quite a range there. Order of magnitude, two orders of an order of magnitude there. 1,000, 700, 700, 300. Allie would know. She probably counted this flock. So that's quite a range. We'll take a look. So 516 in this flock. So 516 little boxes drawn around the eiders. We're going to go through a few of these flocks now and give this a try to see how you do. Here's another smaller flock. This time they're all on water. I'll show you the boxes. They're different. There'll be different colors in each image, and that's just something that the software did, but they indicate the same thing. They just different combinations of plumage color, background, and then wing position. So I blew it on that one. 645. It's going to get a little harder here. So how about this one? So here's a larger flock, and there are birds both on the water and on the ice along this lead too. It's showing both things. So we're over an order of magnitude bigger here. 7,000 birds. And here's another larger flock, all on mostly on ice. There's a few birds in areas of open water. What's your best guess for this flock? 25,000. It's a lot of eiders. 20,000, 15,000. Pretty good. 18,000. Some good guesses out there. Almost 14,000. 13,949 for this flock. Here's a hard one. Flocks like this are difficult because the birds are in discrete clumps. They're not even throughout the photo, and these tend to be hard to estimate. So take your best guess here. 1,800, 10,000, 10,000. 17,000, 10,000. Just under 16,000. So 15,984 little boxes here. All right, here's the last one. What are your guesses for this one? Lots. 25,000, 20,000. 17, pretty good. 17,793. That last guess, I think, had some inside information. And one Pacific walrus. Did you catch that at the top of the photo there? I'll back up so you can see it without the box. So right here, you can see it. Can you even see the tusks? All right, so just to review the protocol we use here, we use transmitter locations to determine where the survey was flown. The survey was based on transects to look for flocks of eiders, and those flocks of eiders are photographed, and the photographs annotated. So the next step is not as simple as summing the counts from all the photos, and my colleague Erik Osnas will talk about that stage of the process and what getting an estimate involves. So I will go on mute and let.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks a lot. I'm the biometrician from the Fish and Wildlife Service, and so shown in this picture is the all the various survey tracks that we flew. We had four different panels of tracks, and each transect was separated by about 7 kilometers, and we only had enough gas in the plane to do one of these color panels and then go back to Nome. So each day we'd go out and do a separate one, and you can see the flocks match the transect colors that we saw. So that's the survey design that we used. But as you might imagine, we flew along these transects, and so we didn't survey the entire area. So if there's flocks in the middle of two transects, maybe there's some chance we didn't see it. And so that's the sort of the hard part that we've been trying to work on, is how do you go from counting those flocks to the total number of eiders in this study area. And oh, yeah, could you advance the slides, Dan? Yeah, so as Dan said, it's not as simple as just summing the flocks up, but here's the sum of for each replicate. And the number of flocks. I'm pointing at the screen. Of course, you can't see me point at the screen. But in the first replicate, we saw only 9 flocks. But if you sum all those up, it's 200,000 individuals. It turns out that the biggest flock, I'll show this on the next slide, but biggest flock was about 100,000 birds. So that was really amazing. The second replicate, 18, 12, and then 41 flocks at that last day. And as you sum them up, you get, in that 160, 150,000 birds. But the next slide. And so here's what I just was sort of saying is the mean flock size. So if you just take the average flock size, each on average across all those flocks is about 9,500 individuals, with a minimum of 62, and like I said, a maximum of just over 95,000. That's an amazingly huge range of flock sizes. So with that amount of variation across flock sizes, the small ones you are probably hard to see, and the big ones you're probably going to see without too much trouble. So next slide. Okay, but this is the key part, is we can't just sum up the number of individuals we saw, and for these first 3 reasons, is that not all flocks are seen from the transect. So flocks that are near to the transect are more likely to be seen than flocks that are far from the transect. And then big flocks are more likely to be seen than small flocks. And then this is a thing about planes, aerial surveys, is that flocks right under the plane are less likely to be seen. And that's a pretty common pattern across lots of different animals and surveys, that from planes is oftentimes if you're inside the plane, you can't see straight under the plane. The pilots can oftentimes see ahead of the plane, but if you've ever looked at, been in a plane looking out the window, the ground near you, like right underneath the plane, looks like it's moving really fast, right? And the ground out far from the plane looks like it's moving slower. So you actually have more time to inspect areas that are farther away from the plane. And so, there's some chance of you being able to see them sort of at intermediate distances is kind of how that works out. But you can't look straight under the plane and they disappear. So for those 3 main reasons, we can't just add the flocks up. We know there are more eiders out there than we actually saw. And so the hard sort of mathematical puzzle is how to account for those 3 things. The other thing is kind of the more boring part, which is the standard thing that biometricians do, is we only sampled the transects. We didn't sample the whole survey area. So we have to use statistics that kind of extrapolate from our sampled area to the whole study area. And those are methods that have been worked out and are pretty straightforward. So that's not the main problem here. It's this flocks size thing, or the not seeing the flocks, that's the main problem. And I actually forgot to add one bullet, but there's another one, and it's related to that animation Dan showed about the radiotelemetry is there could be flocks that are outside the survey area that we never had a chance to survey or even see because we weren't looking outside the study area. So from the radiotelemetry, we're pretty confident that most of them were inside the study area. So that's good. But there's a chance that there could be a flock outside the study area. The next slide. So here's, this is a histogram of the distance from the plane. So the zero on the x-axis here is 0 is right under the plane. And then this is in meters. So 1,000 is 1 kilometer to about 4 kilometers away from the plane. And the height of each bar here is the number of flocks that were seen at that distance. And the key takeaway here is that there's a peak kind of at this intermediate distance. So right around 1,000 meters out, that's where we tend to see most of the flocks. You'd expect some random variation through time or across distance bins. But by looking at this, you can see there's big missing parts out far from the thing. I think if you press the button, Dan, yeah, there we go. Out here at far distances, you can see there tends to be fewer flocks seen than close. This is because they're too far. And it's just getting harder to see them as they get farther away. And then push the button again. And then under that, you can see as you get close to the plane at 0 distance, there seems to be some flocks missing here too. And that's a very common pattern with aerial surveys. So this idea of detection of the flocks or the animal being dependent on distance is a very common problem in wildlife surveys, and it's been pretty well figured out in a method called distance sampling. So if you can record the distance and with this histogram, you can fit a model that explains how the probability of detection changes with distance. I think you should hit the button now, Dan. Yeah, there we go. So we did that, and we fit this model. This is the same histogram. I've just overlaid some model results, and I'll explain that right now. The points are individual data points, and the line here, the solid line in the middle, is the average detection probability with distance. And you can just see that it's high near the plane. That's an assumption of this model, this particular model that I fit. And then it declines with distance. And each point is a different flock. And I think push the button, Dan. There we go. The ones up here at the top are the big flocks. And so you can see that the big flocks can essentially be seen with the same probability across all distances. And then push the button again. And the small flocks actually decline, the detection rate declines more. And that makes sense, I think, and that's a common pattern as well. And I think it makes sense to most people that think about it. It's easier to see big things than small things. But we can use this model then to adjust our probabilities and ask, well, how many flocks did we not see? And interestingly, what is the average flock size of all the flocks, including the ones we didn't see? And this is a technique that's called distance sampling, and it's pretty widely applied. But one very important assumption that it makes is that at distance 0, or you see 100% of the flocks. And you can see in this data that's not met. So this cluster over here on the left where there's missing ones under the plane, that makes it a particularly complicated problem. And there are methods to work on that, and they involve a variety of assumptions. And we're trying to assess those and work into incorporating that type of detection problem into this analysis. Next slide. So if you take that distance sampling model, and like I told you, the observed flock size was about 9,500. But if you account for all the small flocks that we probably didn't see, it turns out the actual true flock size was significantly less than that. It's more like 7,400. And that's important because if you just took like the average flock size that you observed and multiplied it by your estimate of how many flocks there were and expanded that to the whole study area, you'd overestimate the population. So by calculating this, you get a smaller flock size, but you get more flocks seen. So this can be an important effect. And then I'll just cut to the chase, is that from that same model, we can get an estimate of how many or what percentage of the flocks did we see. And that simple model that I showed you, it turns out that it's about 70% of we only saw about 70% of the flocks, but that assumes that we saw them all under the plane, and that's not true. So this is probably an overestimate. You can fit another model that actually takes a bunch of assumptions and fit a detection model, and it suggests we only saw a little under 60% of the flocks. So that means your final estimate will be larger for this model 2 than for model 1. So, and it kind of depends on the assumptions of how you think about those missed flocks under the plane. So next slide. So yeah, so we're working to put that all together into incorporating that distance detection, the flock size, and really the most important, one of the more complicated things is that detection near the plane. And so next bullet point, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but we've decided we're not really ready to say how many total eiders there are, because we haven't quite dotted all our I's and crossed all our T's, and we're kind of scratching our head on this analysis a little bit. But I'm pretty confident that we'll probably double the number of eiders that we actually saw. It'll be kind of in that range of maybe 2 to 3 times as many that we actually counted. And the estimate will be pretty uncertain, largely because the flock size is so variable. When the flock size is so variable like that, it makes the final estimate fairly variable. And so I'm done with my section.
Okay, thanks, Eric. So I'm Dave Safine, and I'm going to take over here for a minute. And by the way, if you guys are having any trouble hearing me, let me know, and maybe I'll try to turn my video off. My internet's not fantastic here, so just let me know. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit. We've been talking quite a bit about the winter survey, and I'm going to talk a little bit about where these birds are in the summertime, what Dan was speaking about previously, and I'm going to talk about how we do surveys in those breeding areas. Go ahead, Dan. So generally speaking, as Dan indicated, there's a breeding population in northern Alaska and western Alaska, and we have 2 different surveys to count the birds in those areas. So along the north slope of Alaska, that area that's sort of lavender color is what we call the Arctic Coastal Plain Breeding Pair Survey. And I'll talk about that in detail in a minute here. And then along the coast of western Alaska, we have surveys that you see a little bit of green color, and then on the outer coast, you see sort of a white zone. That white area is what we call the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta Coastal Zone Survey. That green color is part of a different survey, which you see throughout the interior, and that's primarily to count ducks. So I'm going to focus in on that very outer coast of the Yukon Delta and then the north slope. Go ahead. So just for a second here, I want to talk about how we do surveys in breeding areas, because it's quite a bit different than what we discussed and the details of how we do that in the wintering area. In many ways, these breeding pair surveys are quite a bit easier because instead of birds congregating in those large flocks that Dan and Erik were talking about, these birds, once they get to breeding areas, are much more dispersed, and they're generally in just one male, a pair, maybe two pairs or two males, but very small groups dispersed over large areas. So we no longer really use photography for these types of surveys. We can have our observers fly over these birds and just simply count the birds, those they can observe and identify. So what you see in the upper right here is an airplane flying along. And so in this case, instead of flying up at 1,500 feet, as Dan was describing, we're now flying at about 125 feet. So fairly low, a little bit slower because we're in a smaller airplane. We're in a Cessna 206 on amphibious floats. So we're flying about 87, 90 knots. And we have observers, generally speaking, our pilot is an observer looking out the left window. We have another observer looking out the right window. Sometimes we have looking out the right window. So all those individuals are looking for eiders as we're flying along. And in the bottom there, you can see an image of what it actually looks like when you're flying on, and that particular image is from the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. So lots of wetlands out there, little islands and things, and periodically we run across some eiders. When we do, we dictate into the microphone. We saw a pair of spectacled eiders, and that's linked up with the latitude and longitude of that observation. And later we transcribe that and it gets into a data sheet. Next slide, please. So like I said, we're counting these relatively small groups of birds along the transects. So in that little diagram you can see in the bottom, you see 5 different example transects. Some of those transects have eiders, some do not have eiders. And some have higher densities and lower densities. And so we would look across all those transects, figure out, the average density that we have, and then so we can extrapolate out to that whole survey area, say the whole coastal area of the Yukon Delta or the Arctic coastal plain, approximately how many birds are in that area based upon the birds that we saw. And the counts that I'm going to talk about today are not adjusted for detection. So what Erik was just talking about, where there's the birds that we photographed, or in this case, the birds that we saw, that's what I'm going to be referring to. And like I said, we're not correcting for the birds that are out there that we did not observe. There are ways to do that, but what I'm going to talk about today will not have that correction. So next slide, please. So on that outer coast of the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, we've been surveying this area since the late 1980s up through this last summer. We tend to fly that area at the end of May or early June, which is the period when most of the birds are on the breeding areas. They are dispersed out, and generally speaking, they're in that egg laying or early incubation period. And the transects in this area, which are those red lines you can see, in some areas, the northern areas, which have lower densities of birds, they tend to be spread out several miles, up to 8 miles apart. Also in the southern areas, which is down toward the mouth of the Kuskokwim. But that area in the middle that looks very red is what we call the Central Coast. And that area, which is kind of between Nelson Island and the Askonuk Mountains, or just north of Hooper Bay, the Skama Bay area, those transects tend to be about 1 mile apart, so very dense because that area has the highest density of the birds we're interested in. So spectacled eiders, cackling geese, emperor geese, etc. And so we're counting all the larger water birds, geese, swans, cranes, ducks, eiders, etc. on this survey. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so now on that Arctic coastal plain survey, very similar to what I just described for the Yukon Delta. Obviously a different geography. So now we're flying from approximately Point Lay in the west all the way over to Koktovik in the east. Again, the density varies. The density of the transects varies depending on the density of the birds. and sometimes for other reasons or interest for the partners funding this or development activities, et cetera. So you see a high density of transects around the Tashekpuk Lake area, higher densities as we get to the northern part of the Arctic coastal plain. And then the southern areas where we have lower densities of birds, we're going to have lower densities of transects. So because this is such a large geography on the Arctic coastal plain, those transects are spread much farther apart, but we're counting the same species of birds. And one difference on this survey, both we have an observer on the left and the right side. On the Yukon Delta, we only have an observer on the right side. So 2 versus 1 observer. And that image on the top there is a photograph of what it looks like when you're flying the Arctic coastal plain. The are highly variable, but one very recognizable feature on the Arctic coastal plain is a polygonal tundra. So what you're seeing in this image, we might call low center polygon. So they have that water in the middle and then that rim of tundra around. And those are very common on the Arctic coastal plain. You don't see that type of tundra when you're in the subarctic on the Yukon Delta. Next slide, please. So here are some of the results. So we're going to talk about the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta first. So like Dan was saying, these birds were listed in the early 1990s at a time when these numbers were at, the population numbers were at very low levels. So since that time of listing, there was approximately a 2.5 to 3 decade period that these birds were doing really well and increasing, sometimes at up to 8% per year increase. So they hit, sort of their highest levels, perhaps between 10 and 2020 or so. And they kind of leveled out a little bit at that time. So they went from maybe 1,000-ish birds all the way up to, over 6,000 birds on the Yukon Delta. We had 1 year that we didn't fly surveys during the pandemic in 2020. And then we came back from that surveying again in 2021, same observer, and saw drastically lower numbers. We thought, well, that was went back again and again, and that trend has kind of continued, these very low counts. And then last year in 2025, we had one of our lowest counts ever. It was less than 1,000 birds. So we've been seeing a pretty significant drop-off since approximately 2019. And again, very low numbers last year. Next slide, please. The Arctic coastal plain, generally a similar kind of process going on there. This time series is only going back to 2007 instead of the late 1980s. But the birds were, generally stable, perhaps slightly increasing for a period of time. And they were up around that 6,000 count. And then, this decline started perhaps a little earlier, maybe around 2015. Numbers were kind of slowly going down. And then again, after around 2020, when we started collecting data again, in this case, we had 2 years we didn't collect data during the pandemic. When we resumed surveys, we were at much lower numbers, around 2,000. Last year's survey count was a little bit higher instead of it being lower like the Yukon Delta. So that was good to see. But we're still perhaps seeing about half of the birds that we had seen about 10 to 15 years ago. So still much lower numbers. Next slide, please. So just to summarize here, we are observing declines in both of those breeding areas, both the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta and the Arctic coastal plain. So when we see declines like this, we often ask ourselves, is this just fewer birds coming to the breeding areas, or does this actually mean there's fewer birds in those breeding populations? And sometimes it's hard to tell the difference in between. The more years you have, even if it is just fewer birds arriving, if they're not breeding, then the actual population is going to drop regardless. And so the more years we have, and we have now had since 2021 or 2022, it's more likely that those are true in the breeding population. So the question is why maybe observing this? Perhaps it is related to the conditions in the wintering areas, and maybe that's leading to these adult females being in poor body condition and either being less likely to come to the breeding areas, or if they come to the breeding areas, less likely to nest or nest successfully. Some of these changes may be due to lower overwinter survival or annual survival rates, again, related to conditions in the wintering areas, and that could be affecting both adults and juveniles. Another factor that's currently happening is, particularly in the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, we have been observing those declines for about the last 10 years or so. And at that same time, the populations right alongside these eiders, in particular cackling geese and emperor geese, have also been decreasing quite a bit. So when there's lots of other birds on the landscape, like these geese, they help to keep the nest success rates of these eiders higher. And when we had these eiders declining in the 1980s and early 1990s, there was also a concurrent decline in the goose population. So we're seeing some similarities there. Other factors that could be involved is avian influenza, which we have been observing since about 2022. And then something that's always exposure to lead shot that is still in wetlands, even though people may have shot it 10 or 20 years ago, and that can lead to chronic reductions in survival rates. So that's a little bit of information about what could be causing some of those declines. And I think I'll turn it back over to Dan to wrap us up here.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Thanks, Eric. So I just want to make a point here that these surveys and the information we get from these surveys are really important. So how is this information, the information from these surveys, how is it used and why is it important? So before I talk about eiders, I'll talk about how it supports other species. So those breeding area surveys that Dave just talked about monitor a suite of water birds, not just eiders. And that information is used by the Fish and Wildlife Service in their conservation planning assistance program. So there's a team of biologists that helps projects, road projects, energy projects, mining projects, avoid and minimize impacts to birds. They rely a lot on those survey data. An example comes from loons or red-throat. So these data also help identify declines in other species and address those declines or learn more about those declines before we need to implement a tool like the Endangered Species Act. And an example of that is red-throated and yellow-billed loons, which have also shown periods of decline detected through these breeding area surveys. Those declines motivated collecting more information about those species and understanding the biology of those species more, and also implementing protection. So for example, yellow-billed loons now have a buffer requirement for a certain area of space around their breeding lakes in the National Petroleum Reserve, Alaska. So in these ways, these breeding area surveys contribute to proactive conservation. So conservation before there's a problem, rather than reactive conservation that happens after a species has already declined. So specific to eiders, which are protected under the Endangered Species Act, these surveys help to meet the legal obligations, the legal requirements of that act. So projects that are federally funded or federally permitted must consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service or NOAA for marine mammals to avoid and reduce impacts of listed eiders and to avoid putting those species in jeopardy. So the biologists at the Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA that apply that ESA Section 7 consultation process use the information on the distribution and abundance of spectacled eiders gathered through these surveys to inform those consultations. These data also contribute to population models. They're combined with other data from banding and monitoring nests to help understand why numbers are changing and also predict into the future how numbers are likely to change under different environmental scenarios. These surveys of eiders also contribute directly to assessing what the status of these populations are relative to the recovery criteria that were set out and the recovery plans for these species, which help gauge how is recovery progressing for these species. Those assessments occur as required by the ESA at least every 5 years. They're 5-year status reviews, and 2026 is a status review year for spectacled eiders. So all the information that has been generated since the last 5-year review will get summarized in a document, a revised document called a species status assessment, which will be used to inform that decision about what the listing category of spectacled eiders is, if it's still appropriate, or if that listing needs to be changed. The public can contribute information to that review. There'll be a public notice going out that essentially says, we're doing this thing. If you have information to contribute, please let us know. So that would be information relative to new threats or old threats that have gone away, changes in distribution, things like that. And my email will be in the next slide if you have something you'd like to contribute. So beyond the Endangered Species Act, there are things, we all can do to help spectacled eiders recover. Especially these things become even more important during these periods of really low abundance where every individual is even more important. So obviously no hunting, this is well known. Historically, spectacled eiders have not been an important species for subsistence. The lead issue is an important one that Dave brought up. So hunting waterfowl, it's been required to use non-toxic ammunition since 1991 when hunting waterfowl. And that's because, like Dave said, the spent lead pellets remain in the ponds where eiders and other waterfowl ingest them while they're feeding and causes lead poisoning. This hasn't been as much of a problem in northern Alaska. It has been a persistent problem in western Alaska. And I put this photo on the bottom here just to emphasize the point that the way that lead is regulated, it's through its possession and use, not its sale. So you can go into a store and still find lead shotgun ammunition, and often it is not labeled as lead, like that box on the right. But it's important to know what you're buying and important to only use non-toxic shotgun ammunition hunting waterfowl. Also supporting co-management. So where Alaska Native governance is directly involved with modifying and creating regulations in collaboration with state and federal agencies like the Alaska Migratory Bird Co-Management Committee. Individuals can also contribute observations through programs like the Local Environmental Observer Network and the Alaska Arctic Observatory and Knowledge Hub. And then you can also send any observations or information you have directly to me. If it's information that you would like to have considered as part of the 5-year status review, please indicate that. And with that, Dave, Eric, and I would be happy to talk more about this. And just thank you for your attention. I'll turn it over to Gabe for this part of the talk.
All right, I was just putting your address in the chat. Book, come on. There we go. I was just putting your address in the chat. And first off, I forgot to mention that all these speakers are in 3 different locations. So Dan was talking to us from Fairbanks. I mean,
Yep.
Dan was in Fairbanks. Eric, you're in Anchorage. Is that correct? And David, normally in Alaska, but tonight he's on the road. He's on a different time zone. He's in Redding, California. So we thank all our speakers for taking the time after their long day already to bring information to us in the Bering Strait region about the spectacled eider. And before we get into questions, this is a good time, and people are already giving the emoji much better at it than me. Also, it's nice in the chat for old people like myself who just type out if there's show some love for our speakers, Dan, Dave, and Eric, for taking the time to let us know the latest. So we really appreciate that. And I know I've got plenty of questions, and I see that Doug has already got his hand up. Go for it, Doug.
I actually have a few questions, but I'll just take them one at a time here.
Okay.
This has to do with a breeding population survey along the YK Delta area. I imagine when the Typhoon Halong went in there, that it I'm wondering if that might, what your speculation is on how that might impact the breeding populations there. I imagine there was saltwater intrusion, siltation. Do the birds just go further inland, do you think, or just general comment?
Dave, do you want to talk about that?
Sure. It's a great question. I appreciate that question. Very difficult to answer. We had the previous typhoon, Merbach, which was just, a couple years before that, a few years before that, and we thought about that, and although the declines we were observing predated that, both of those typhoons. But yeah, no, I mean, it's a really good question. And the answer is, I guess some of the things we might expect is that saltwater intrusion is going to go a lot further inland, right? That water was pushed way farther up. And so when you have increased salinity, we know that has some effects on some species. Eiders, the adults do pretty well with salinity, but the young, there have been some studies showing that the young can have a tough time with salinity. It could affect their growth and other things. And so I think the adult females are pretty good. The Yukon Delta has always been a brackish environment, and the females are pretty good at finding those freshwater ponds to bring the broods to help them during brood rearing period until they're old enough to be able to deal with the salt. But as more and more of those areas that held pretty good fresh water, maybe being a little bit higher, are themselves inundated, then there's just less and less fresh water. So I would expect some potential for effects on the brood rearing habitat and the survival and growth rates of those broods. So that's one potential thing. And then, like you said, habitats can be changed, breeding areas can be changed. And so there could be all kinds of other effects on the nesting habitat itself, brooding habitat, food availability, all sorts of things. So many potential effects. I know from, because we had Merbach and continued to do surveys, but at the same time, several of the species were already kind of going down. So we were already seeing declines in emperor geese, cackling geese, eiders, and other things that had started before that. So it's, I can't answer your question, unfortunately, but I appreciate that. And I guess we'll just continue to monitor and see what's going on out there.
Yeah, I knew all you could do is speculate, but I appreciate that and a very nice overview of the surveys. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
All right. Charlie, your hand is up. The floor is
Hey,
yours.
thank you. Yeah, very interesting. I enjoyed it a lot. I'm a little bit off topic, but so by the way, I in the 1990s tipped off Fish and Wildlife Service that that molting area on Norton Sound, and prior to that, I don't think bird watchers were aware of that, and I was. They got back to me about a year later and said, "Wow, there's all kinds of spectacled eiders there," and I told you so. Anyway, so here's one more. Told you so. The For a while I was a Park Service employee back in the early 2000s, and I was doing fish surveys at Imruk Lake, which is a lake about 800 feet in elevation, central Seward Peninsula, south of Deering. Not Imruk Basin, but Imruk Lake. And there were flocks, like of 100 or so, I think emperor geese, stampeding around on that lake that were molting, and they couldn't fly more than a couple feet off the water, but I had this small rubber raft. I was doing benthic transects on the lake for fish, and there were birds all over the lake. It's about 6 by 8 miles in dimension and about 10 feet deep at the deepest. And then just to the east, there's a place called Burnt River Flats, and that too is about 800 feet in elevation. And it's a big swamp, and it had been burned repeatedly And so there's charred tussocks sticking up out of swamp. And on many of those tussocks are goose nests. And so what appears to be happening is that the geese nest on Burnt River Flat, and then they just fly 10 miles over to Imruk Lake and molt. And on Imruk Lake, there's a number of archaeological sites that have evidence of caribou drives, of fishing weights. And so they must have netted the grayling that were in Imruk Lake. And I don't see how they couldn't have harvested geese as well. So because it's at high altitude, relatively speaking, nobody surveys it. It's counterintuitive that it's an estuary or a marsh area or a waterfowl habitat, but it really is an important one. And so I know it's not eiders, but I've been trying to get people to go look at that. So anyway, thank you.
All right. Thanks for sharing that, Charlie. Appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting. I know there's the Alaska Department of Fish and Game did a really ambitious project of marking emperor geese with satellite transmitters that included birds breeding on the Seward Peninsula. So I'd be curious if any of their individuals stopped to use that lake, but that's a really interesting observation. And thanks for sharing that information on the Norton Sound molt area for spectacled eiders. That is an area that's considered critical habitat for them now. So thanks for contributing to that.
Yeah. You're welcome.
All right. Actually, my question was going to be on the Norton Sound molting area. Now, if you live in Norton Sound, especially in Nome, we don't typically see the eider ducks in Nome. Once in a while, I think we had one come to the harbor, stick around. Everyone talks about it, and it swims around, looks at the boats for a couple days, and then takes off. But the Norton Sound molt area, how is that being studied? Is that something that is actively being studied to see if that is the same importance, or have the eider ducks moved out of there as they're moving around? Like a lot of our marine species are on the move because our whole maritime ecosystem is kind of in transition, right? We've got the pollock coming up and the cod, and the Arctic cod have gone off, but the Pacific cod. So if the ducks are trying to, because they're eating off the bottom, right? Small clams and things like that. If the ecosystems change for them, how will we know that's still an area? Is that being monitored? Or how do you keep saying that? I just don't know.
Yeah, I know that's an important question. The way it has been, there were in the past, prior to critical habitat, there were aerial surveys that were flown over the area. There haven't been recently that I know of, but the satellite transmitter data contributes to understanding how birds are using Norton Sound. So there have been 3 periods now where satellite transmitters have been put out in the 1990s, between 2008 and 2012, and then more recently between 2018 and 2023. And there was a paper by Matt Sexton that compared distribution of locations in Norton Sound during molt between the 1990s and that 2008 to 2012 period that showed a kind of finer scale shift in the area of Norton Sound that they were using. So they're still using Eastern Norton Sound, but an area that's a bit different than what they used in the 1990s. But of course, observations like that don't provide anything on the mechanism, like why. We can speculate it's most likely related to prey, but maybe something else. And that's something we'll do with our more recent telemetry data as well.
I think that would be of interest. Do you know which way they moved, or can you say? Because that's Eastern Norton Sound, we have subsistence harvest and we have commercial harvest at sea. And so it does kind of, I think, for our regional fisheries, I know I hear about it, and it's important to be able to give an answer. Like people are like, well, I don't know, I have no answer for anybody. I could have them call you or call the Fish and Wildlife Service or USGS. I'm not sure. But it would be good to know more on that particularly. I think the region would be interested in that molting area. I don't know if how much that disturbs things, but I know it comes up in conversation quite a bit.
Yeah, no, I can understand that's your backyard there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll send you that paper by Matt
Wonderful.
Sexton. Matt Sexton's the lead author, and I think it came out in 2016, if I remember correctly. But I'll send that to you, and I don't remember off the top of my head in which direction the spatial shift
Okay.
was. Yeah.
Is that the kind of thing like you're asking for that 5-year status or review? If there's sightings and things like that, would that be of interest? We should make sure people call in or write in or get a hold of you for that kind of thing. I put Chuck Manadaluk, who is Coeric Subsistence, and myself down because we often get calls about all kinds of things that are either healthy, sick, odd, and we can pass that information on to you as well regionally. But for that 5-year status thing, there'll be an announcement and then we can all participate.
Yes, so that announcement will get distributed to all village and regional Native corporations, academic,
Tribes.
it's tribes. Yeah, it'll be in the Federal Register too. But
I don't check that very often.
Yeah, no one does,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But that's kind of the official word that should be out
Yeah,
soon.
absolutely.
But you can send those to me. Just be sure to specify this is something I would like to have considered in the 5-year status review of spectacled eiders. And
Okay.
certainly shifts in where they're molting would be of interest.
All right. Thank you very much. That's very helpful. I see no questions in the chat. So Liz, it's all yours. Good to see you on.
Oh, thanks, Kay. Yeah, I just was wondering if you guys could possibly or potentially speak to the eiders' use of sea ice during your replicate surveys. I guess I was just kind of curious, did you see any shifts in the flock as, the ice leaves will change? Did you find the birds were kind of staying put in one specific area, potentially where there was more food availability, or did you kind of see them staying more with the leads and perhaps drifting around a bit?
I think Dave and Eric have some interesting observations because the weather, the predominant wind shifted pretty dramatically between the first few replicates and the last replicate that really affected the distribution and nature of the ice. So that's kind of a finer scale. He could probably give an answer on that scale.
Good question, Liz. I'm going to cross it off my list.
All right, thanks, guys.
Did we lose Dave?
No. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I can speak briefly to that and Eric can follow up. But yeah, I would just say that, I think what we observed was that the birds, and you can really kind of see this in that Dan had that animation that showed kind of our survey area and where all the birds were. And there was sort of a general area they were using, and that may not have changed too much. But within that area, they were moving around. You saw those dots kind of moving around a fair bit. So, day to day or week to week, as conditions changed, obviously they're sort of constantly reshuffling around as leads are closing and opening and moving. But I'm assuming at a larger scale, they're trying to kind of stay over a certain area where there's food. So there's like sort of different scales of movement, at least that we observed. And yeah, so I think it's just really dynamic out there, and they're constantly moving to stay, as close as they can be to the good food. That's my perception anyway. So
I don't know if Eric had anything you'd want to contribute to that.
No, it's just seeing the flocks from day to day. How dynamic they were. The last day of survey that we did was very cold, and a lot of the water was frozen over on the top, and there were lots of smaller flocks just kind of scattered all over the place. And so each day was kind of different, but I think they pretty much stayed in the same spot. Like so, but the ice was very different from day to day.
And yeah, thanks for the question, Liz, and thanks for tuning in. From a longer time scale perspective, if you look at the satellite telemetry work that Margaret Peterson did in the 90s and Margaret Peterson and Matt Sexton did, in the earlier 2000s, there was a pattern where, the birds arrive south of St. Lawrence Island in October, and there isn't ice yet, right? And they would typically be closer to St. Lawrence Island. And then as the ice developed, they would move farther offshore to the southwest and use that farther southwest area for late winter. So in the past, when they flew these surveys, the few times that they did it, that's where they would encounter the birds farther offshore to the southwest. The more recent satellite telemetry data shows that, they're starting in that same area close to the south coast of St. Lawrence Island. The ice comes, but the birds aren't moving. They're remaining in that area that was defined by the survey area in that earlier slide. So that's a notable change. What's causing it, we don't know. There had not been any benthic sampling south of St. Lawrence Island, in that Polinia area anyway, since 2010. That changed last year thanks to the NOAA benthic surveys, who went out of their way to collect some benthic grab samples specifically to help understand eider distribution. And we're working on getting those benthic samples processed and turned into numbers.
Wonderful. And I'm assuming that's the NOAA Race Division 2025 bottom trawl survey.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, NOAA.
Yep. And actually, I can drop their community highlights report, which don't get at everything they found, but for our communities, the NOAA Race Division does an amazing job of providing information before, during, and after their work here in the region. So we really appreciate that. And I'll put a link in there if I can for their community highlights report. All right. And we're so glad that Magadan is joining us. That is our neighbor. So we're always glad when our neighbors come on. So welcome. And you are up. Please ask your question.
Hello, I am Diana Solovyova, and I am working with Spectacled Eiders for 23 years now in Russia. And I have a question mostly to David about the methods of aerial surveys over the breeding grounds, because right now I'm writing a paper about based on the Sonia Rosenfeld surveys over the entire Russian breeding grounds of Spectacled Eiders. And what we found that we could not compare Sonia's survey with historical surveys of 1993 to 95 made by US Fish and Wildlife Service, just because Sonia was taking pictures, and back in 90s people were not taking pictures, and not taking pictures. Maybe it's advantage. It's easy, it's comparable, but it's comparable only for the areas you are familiar with. When people were flying over Russia, they certainly confuse species. And for instance, they counted a lot of Spectacled Eiders in the Lino Delta, where never ever Spectacled Eider nest and been reported. So there are so many, we expect, mistakes when people did surveys for the first time over the unfamiliar area. And thus we could not compare what we have now from Sonia's photographs to what people did 30 years ago. So do you have any paper we can compare your method of surveys to the photographic methods of surveys? That is my question.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Good question.
Yeah, and it's good to see your face. I met you many years ago.
Yeah.
I recognize you. Yeah, so I guess one of my questions is, and we were working with Sonia. She came over and worked with us, I think it was in 2016, and helped learn about some of our methods. So we had some overlap with Sonia for at least that year in 2016, and we were in touch for a while as they started their work. So I'm familiar with some of that, but I guess one of my questions is your question is, do we have papers to talk about how to compare photography versus ocular surveys. I'm not 100% sure the methods that Sonia used, and so was she photographing flocks or groups along the way, or was it a camera running the whole time? I'm not 100% sure. My supervisor was the person that was more in contact with her.
She used about the same method as you, but she not record the birds. She just took a photo of any eider, any bird she can see from the plane.
Okay, I see. So she's still doing sort of breeding pair surveys, but just photographing all the birds instead of,
Yeah.
dictating it. Okay. So, I mean, I would think generally speaking, those methods, obviously, if you have photographs and you can determine the species and sex of the birds, then that's fantastic. We don't have that photographic information. We're working on some methods. Erik is using overhead photography from the belly. But anyway, to answer your question, we don't have current papers comparing those type of methods. We have not used photography, what I would call oblique photography, out the window like we did on that winter survey on. We've only used oblique photography during the fall for Steller's eiders, and then during the winter, but we have not used it oblique photography on the breeding areas.
I see.
Yeah, so we haven't used that method, so we can't necessarily. So I don't have information on how to compare that. But anyway,
Do you
Erik,
have a
do you want to
paper?
say
Do you have a paper, David, that defines what you did so that she could, or the person she's asking for, could then look at what you did or how you guys did this and then be able to compare with what they did? Is that a
Yeah.
way to?
We do have, say from the Yukon Delta or the Arctic Coastal Plain, we have, several reports in
Technical.
there. So yeah, there's some information we can provide if she wants to see some of those methods. Go ahead.
Is it possible to drop something in the chat? Also, Dan, if you can stop sharing, we'd all see each other. I'm sort of it's hard for me. I'm close, but thank you. But is there any paper you can drop in the chat while we're visiting?
Yep. The most recent one I could put in there is a report that Erik and I and some of our coworkers worked on and produced last February, which is for the Arctic Coastal Plain. So we do have a report for that. And I can.
It's online. You could just drop the Fish and Wildlife Service webpage.
Brilliant.
Yeah. So
sorry, I could not open Fish and Wildlife Service from Russia
Yeah,
now.
yeah.
Okay, maybe we can work around that.
Drop it in the, can you open any of the files? You should be able to in the chat. I dropped a file with the fisheries.
yeah, I can get the PDF and put it in there. That would be our most recent Arctic Coastal Plain survey, which uses, like I said, the same methods as the Yukon.
And we described the survey methods in that report, don't we? I think so.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Do it while they're on.
Yeah, while right now, like
Yeah,
if you could put it on the chat, that would be awesome.
I can. Dave, can you grab
yeah,
it?
we got it. Thank you.
Yeah, just give me a second and I'll pull it up.
I just wanted to add to the question is, I'm not 100% sure of what Sonia did actually. I mean, I know some of the older surveys that were done in Russia in the 90s that we did, but I'm not sure what Sonia did. But one of the key aspects as to whether or not you could compare them is whether she did like systematic transects over an area and then counted all the ducks along them. And if that's the case, then the photograph versus just a human counter, I don't think is a big difference, except that there could be a difference in detection, right? You might have better detection from the photos. I'm not sure. So, but that would be the thing. If she didn't do like systematic transects, it's a little bit more problematic to compare them. Except if she repeated the transects through time. Like she had historic transects and then did the same ones again. You could compare those, but you could compare those, but it's a little bit harder than if you do these systematic ones over a larger area, I guess. So that's all I'll have to say.
Well, what Sonia did, she repeated transects from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service because she got it from Julian Fisher. But my concern, because I am writing a paper, not Sonia. Sonia is not an eider specialist. And my problem now is that I know for sure that during the historical surveys, they counted spectacled eiders in the Lena Delta, where there is no spectacled eiders. So how can I trust the species identification during the historical survey? Because I know that there was a big mistake for the Lena Delta.
Oh.
This is my question.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Yeah, I don't know how to address that. Yeah.
Well, hopefully, okay, David Safine just put in the chat the 2025 ACP report. So let us know if you can download that, if you're able to.
Oh,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah, we can. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Awesome. You bet.
And
Wonderful.
I'll just add one other thing that could be something that may or may not help. But, you know, we've done, like Dan was talking about earlier, we've done a fair amount of telemetry over the years. We have marked birds, you know, mostly in the Yukon Delta, also on the Arctic coastal plain. We have not marked breeding birds in Arctic Russia. But some of our birds have gone there for molt and other times. But I guess I'm curious if, and I don't know if Dan would know this, because you were talking about birds not being present on the Lena Delta. Dan, do you know if any of our, any birds that were marked, aside from molting, were ever using areas in, you know, in that area in Arctic Russia?
I would have to look. I don't know off the top of my head, but that's a good question. I'll get back to you on it.
So that's something that could help a little bit is, you know, if any of that area was documented being used in other studies aside from aerial surveys, that would be something worth looking at anyway.
All right. Well, hopefully that's working. And there's another paper that Dan just put in, or a link. I don't know if our neighbor's able to access that link.
We'll try.
Okay. Let us know if you have success. And there's a gentleman with his hand up. If you are done for the moment, you can always ask more questions.
Yeah.
Shall we we'll let you download first.
Yeah, this is Doug Molyneux. I just would encourage you to drop whatever reports you have that they may be able to use there in Magadan. So while you have them on board, drop whatever you can in there for them. And while you're looking up reports, I just have a general question. Early on, you mentioned about the 3 different breeding populations in, I think it was 4 different molting locations. And I'm wondering if those are genetically distinct populations or if there's much mixing between them.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think what the telemetry data has shown is that females are pretty faithful to where they molt, but males move around.
And the breeding populations are distinct?
Similar situation, right? So females are faithful to their nest sites. The males will go with the female they pair with that year. So a given male might pair and mate with a female on the YK Delta one season, and then the next year they're in Arctic Russia, the male is, but the female from the prior year will be in the same breeding location.
Okay, so there's gene flow between the populations. Thank you.
Yeah, and there's some evidence too that there's some low level of juvenile dispersal too. In the 90s, there was the impacts of lead in some localized area were high enough on survival that those areas would have been extirpated if it hadn't had some level of dispersal maintaining it. And that's in a really useful paper by Paul Flint and colleagues on the population dynamics of spectacled eiders.
There is a paper about genetics by, I'm a co-author, I forgot who is the first author, sorry. And I should note that males are also site fidelic, because we have evidence from banding that the male returned to the same area with the same female. So it's not exactly that all males are not site fidelic.
All right. We appreciate that. It's good. If you have the paper, maybe you can, or your assistant, he looks like he's very computer savvy, that young man. He could maybe throw it in here if these gentlemen don't know about that paper. I'm not a eider biologist at all, but I'm just trying to help facilitate information back and forth. Yeah. Very good.
Well, I will, but it's not my computer. I cannot
okay.
share it.
Get your assistant on it. He looks like he knows what he's doing. Very nice. Yeah.
Looks like more files shared.
Awesome. Yeah. All right. So any other questions? How are you guys all holding up, Dan, Eric, and Dave? I've got a couple questions on my list. Some have been asked and some haven't. And I'm very interested in this story of the eiders because it's so Bering Strait, right? It's always our thing. Are you guys holding up okay? Okay.
Yeah.
You're talking to real biologists when they're talking about their subject. You guys probably could keep going, but we won't drag you out too further. But you know that NOAA's ice seal, are you familiar with the Alaska Fisheries Science Center in Seattle? That group, the Polar Ecosystem Program led by Michael Cameron, just finished I don't know if it definitely wasn't transboundary. However, they do surveys at the same time that the Russian Federation does marine mammal surveys. And they're using cameras and they're flying higher, but they have some really good optics and lots of different ways of looking at things. They are flying all over the northern Bering Sea in a very, very close pattern. I mean, huge effort. Are they able to, I was just trying to think how to help you guys.
Yeah,
Okay,
no,
so
I've talked with Paul Kahn about that survey a lot when we were revisiting doing the survey. That seal survey is amazing. I mean, it makes the logistics of the winter
huge.
survey for eiders look easy. And their use of infrared photography too is really, really cool. But for eiders, because they're in these large flocks, it's not we don't need to use a tool like that.
Okay. I just thought maybe they might be able to give you. The other one is Heather Renner's group out of Homer, Alaska, with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Maritime Refuge is coming to the region in July. I think they're coming into Nome and then they're going to go further north. So they're coming up in the Tekla ship. Is there any way, or are you talking with them if they could take a little zip over to Norton Sound? Is that a proper time?
Research cruises tend not to like to do little zips because they are so expensive.
But for spectacled eiders, they might just do that. But I was just wondering if that's something, because they're coming up, and I don't know, maybe they can do that. I don't know, if just to let you be aware of that opportunity. They will be bringing that ship up, and it's going to be bird focused.
Okay.
And it's coming to Norton Sound and then continuing on. And I think they're actually going to spend several days in Norton Sound. So maybe they'll take a shore day and take it over to Norton Sound. Who knows? Eastern Norton Sound. But anyway, I just wanted to make you aware of that.
Yeah, good to know. Thank you.
And one of my last questions from this end is avian influenza. So we know we've had it. And I was saying earlier, we've had many, many calls back in 2022. We had positive both in birds, glaucous gulls, as well as red fox. And this is for us out here, this is a serious situation for, we have stellar sea lions, which are known. We have not had any reports yet of positives. We're not thick, robust with samples. but it's something that could happen. Same for the ice seals, right? We know that the ice seals, and we've got bearded seals, ring seals, spotted seals, and what did I leave out? Ribbon seals, ring seals. Those are very important, not only for conservation concerns, but these are for food security concerns, both the seabirds and the marine mammals. So I know that we're not on the forefront of the Fish and Wildlife Service testing for that. And it's for the seabirds, although that's where we kind of, since the glaucous gulls were positive and we had many over 120 reports of birds in distress, and not just single birds. Those were 120 events being called in where, 25 birds down on their nest, boom, wings outstretched, had been thriving around, or whatever, I mean, writhing around sort of spastically before their death. Hundreds of birds in one report, including foxes and geese. I mean, it was a mess in 2022, but we unfortunately couldn't send. Are there plans for testing the sea ducks in any kind of systematic way that would include the Bering Strait region? Or do we just do as we do, and Chuck Manadaluk, myself, and a few others try to do what we can and get those carcasses to you? Is there any plans?
I don't know of any proactive surveillance for AI. Gabe or Eric, do you?
So, there was a period of, so I guess let me ask you one question, Gabe. You were saying in 2022, you guys observed a lot of, sickness and mortality. What have you guys seen the last, I guess, from 2023 to 2025? Were you still seeing dead or sick birds out there? Were you seeing fewer?
Well, everything's a little bit, it's hard to, yes, we saw in 2020, I want to say 3, the numbers have, from that 2022, mind you, just to back up, those warm years where the numbers went down with loss of ice, or I would correlate that with loss of ice. Your 2020, 2015, you had kind of the end of something, or you had a low year. And then you get to 2017, 2018, 19, and you're going down. That is when we lost our coverage, the quality, duration, and extent of sea ice, especially 2017 and 2018. At that time, right, the southern Bering Sea ecosystem started rolling into ours and creating a lot of pressure on everything. And in 2017 and 2018, we didn't even know about avian influenza. 27 and 2018 began a multi-species, multi-year die-off in the Bering Strait region due to malnutrition. We were collecting birds and sending them in, all kinds of birds, murres, gulls, pick your gull, seabirds, shearwaters, lots. And those birds we were sending to anybody we could, because we have no federal presence here. The largest federal presence in the Bering Strait region is the Post Office and the FAA, right? That's it. And the Park Service and one U.S. Border and Customs, but no marine resource or biological resources, fisheries or seals or anything. So we're on our own. So those years began when that ice pulled back. Ecosystem, warm water, everybody came north, charging north. Our ecosystem of small fatty forage fish, you can see that in that community report, or their earlier community reports as well, you can get online. Starvation. It was if the carrying capacity, data-free opinion, it was as if the carrying capacity had shifted. So it didn't matter if you were a skimmer, a diver, murres were starving. If a murre can't find food in the water column of the Bering, we're not that deep. So there wasn't food. So we had all this starvation going on. Then in 2022, we experienced the largest most persistent, most toxic algal bloom in the Bering Strait from St. Lawrence Island right up into the Chukchi that lasted 2.5 months. And that was concurrent with the die-offs and concurrent with this avian influenza, what we think, based on the behaviors of the birds, all these different birds, and that we had some birds and mammals that were positive. It was a kind of a hot mess. 2020, and we've still seen those die-offs, starvation. It has tapered off, but it is still ongoing. I have to look up the year. In 24 or 25, I happen to be, do you know where the Punguk Islands are? Off Northeast Cape. So if you look at St. Lawrence Island, Northeast Cape on the northeast corner quadrant, about 8 miles offshore, there's a small group of islands off there called the Punguk Island Complex. And if you're on the main island of Punguk, there were birds washing up. I wasn't there for birds, but kittiwakes, just kittiwakes, and several other kinds. And I was swabbing them, and we didn't have refrigeration, and people just told us to throw those away. So I would say it's less than 2022. However, it just continues, right? I would say last year is probably one of the easiest years we've had, which is the least amount of dead birds washing up. Is that because we're done, or is that because bird numbers are less? That's for you guys to tell us, and we would appreciate any kind of help in this, because we worry. We're not a fiscally robust region. We are very much reliant on our marine ecosystem for food, and throughout our communities. Not so much perhaps in the transportation and communication hub of Nome, though we are, not to lessen that, but throughout the region, we're really dependent. So these things that are happening in the ecosystem, being concurrent, have been alarming, right? Warm water, seeing southern fish, seeing this, what looks like, and bring on the salmon problem where the fish are actually getting smaller, indicating maybe they're not getting as much food as they want. It just seems like there's a whole host of concurrent issues. Long answer. Hope that helps. But we could use some help. And I was going to say, Andy Ramey in June, I think it's going to be June 3rd. Sorry, Carol. June 3rd, he will be giving us an update on avian influenza. And I don't know what he'll give us, but hopefully might be some good news regarding testing. We continue to swab birds if we can, if they're fresh. And I've got, I don't know, 16, 18 seabirds of good condition in the freezer from last summer. Different species, no eiders, but shearwaters and things like that. And they're just sitting there hoping someday someone has something. You could take a look at them, test them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite a situation.
Yep.
On the Yukon Delta National Wildlife Refuge, I know the refuge will sample birds that are suspected cases of AI. So they still do that, but there's no kind of sampling plan other than kind of reacting to birds that are observed sick. That 2022 outbreak occurred on Kegayak Island as well, and samples were collected. Erik was on that paper too, and summarized in a paper recently. And if I remember right, the take-home story for eiders seemed to be that we didn't observe sick birds or find carcasses. And when we tested birds for antibodies, they tested positive for H3 antibodies, kind of indicating that they had the infection but recovered. Small sample, but that's the story that sample told.
We found one dead eider during that survey.
And it was negative. Yeah.
Was it? Okay. Yeah.
So no, there's a story to be told for the Bering Strait region. I know since we don't have people up here from the federal government, it's hard to get that story told. But we're here to tell it when you guys are ready. And like I say, we're sitting on samples. We try to work with the museum. We try to work with National Wildlife Health Center. She's a heroine, the lady who's in charge there.
Yeah.
She she does what she can, and probably more than she should. And we're so grateful to her. I can't think of her name right now. I think she's a heroine. Liz Labunski would know the name.
I'm blanking on her name too. I'll just say that, just generally speaking, related to avian influenza, like we discussed in 2022, we were observing a lot of birds and having a lot of positive, Barb, okay. Birds that were testing positive in multiple areas in the state.
Barbara Bodenstein.
Yep. And elsewhere in North America. Since then, and Andy is the expert here, so he'll explain this much better than me. But what I have personally, sort of through talking with folks, is we're not observing very much going on in the breeding areas in Alaska anymore. Not that there isn't avian influenza, but we're not seeing like die-offs of note since 2022. However, the disease is still very much present, and we're seeing more die-offs, at least in waterfowl, in the fall and winter time when they're down south. Like I just read a report, I think from Barb, indicating that I believe it was in the prairie somewhere. I think it was Kansas. Don't quote me on that. There was a very large die-off of geese this, I think it was late winter. I mean, we're talking like tens of thousands of geese died. So there's still die-offs going on. There's still die-offs in the Pacific of geese. So it really affects geese quite a bit. It can affect sea ducks too, and other ducks. But my point is, we're still seeing avian influenza. It's out there. It's still killing birds, but we're not seeing as much effects in the breeding areas in the north. That's the pattern that I've noted. Again, Andy is the expert there. But as far as collecting samples from you guys and others, Rob Kaler, who works with Liz in our office, is kind of the person that generally handles that. And I know Rob and can check in with him on, so the ability to move seabird carcasses and stuff out. I would talk with Liz and Rob about that. And then AI, there was a period of time there. For a couple of years, we did hire an avian influenza coordinator. So we had so many sick and dead birds coming in 2022. The Fish and Wildlife Service actually hired somebody for a couple of years, January Frost. And unfortunately, the funding kind of ran out. So we were not able to keep January on. So we no longer have that staff member to help us with that. So anyway, just a quick update.
All right. There's also in the chat from Diomede. Hi, Opic. What are these birds, the different species we've just been talking about? What are their lifespans? And I don't have any idea for a spectacled eider. What is the lifespan? And could the die-offs be those birds' end of lifespan? And I would say, Opic, these guys will give you a much more fancier answer, but my quick answer would be we just don't see what we saw back then, where all of a sudden we have hundreds of birds washing up, different birds. If it was end of life, which I can see where you're going with that makes sense, but we'd have it more often, I think, and I should say that, but we've been doing it every year, but it's kind of been getting less. So yeah, we'll let the pros answer that better than I could. Go for it, gentlemen.
For lifespan of a spectacled eider, I think, for birds, they're relatively long-lived. They're not an albatross. But for waterfowl, their lifespan is comparatively long. I think they can live, 10, 15 years. I don't know what the longevity record is. I think we did an analysis to estimate from banding data what the average age of a breeding bird was, so a bird on a nest at Kigak Island, and came up with 8 years old. So kind of like that peak reproductive years are around 8 years old, but in terms of longevity, up to 15.
Does that help?
Sorry.
Okay, I'm sorry. I was just asking if the person if that helped answer the questions. Maybe there were other species I don't know she wanted to know about. I don't know if she can unmute.
One
And
thing
then-
I'll just add, like if it was an end of lifespan kind of thing, you would expect a constant flow of dead animals coming all the time, right? And at some low level, kind of at, if it's a stable population, at sort of the rate of reproduction. But when you see these big bursts of dead animals come, then you know that mortality has kind of spiked. Something strange has happened.
Does that help, Opik?
He said,
Yep.
thanks.
Thanks. Right on. Good. Glad you're on. All right, Doug, you've been so patient.
Yeah, that's another question while we have our Russian colleagues on. I'm
Yeah.
wondering what their incidence of avian flu is over in that neck of the woods there.
I don't know if they can give us that, but but I'll leave that up to the responder. And there may be reasons.
Again, over in Russia, are they having a problem with avian flu over in Russia?
I'm sorry, I really don't know about flu in Russia. I'm just we don't work with avian influenza in our region, so I can't tell anything.
That's
Yeah,
fine.
and
Thank
we
you, though.
appreciate that. We appreciate that. No worries there. There can be some issue with responding to the direct questions, not on our side of things, but more on parents. You know what I was saying earlier, parents. They can, you got to be careful on we want to make sure we're doing it right. And another, so thank you very much. Spasibo Bolshoi. How does persistent organic pollutants that's in the Arctic play a role in sick birds? Otherwise, is that never studied? And I would imagine, Opik, you mean for the eiders or in general? The spectacled eiders? All birds. Okay.
That's a good question and outside of my realm of expertise.
Okay. So they can't answer that one on this particular straight science, but that lets me know we should probably get someone who could answer that. You know, a contaminants is a very different specialty. So, okay, it's okay. She wrote, no worries. It's all right. Is that studied?
Yes.
Okay. So that would be, I think you call that POPs, POP. Is there someone who's in your office that does that, or is there I can contact you later on that.
Yeah, no, not currently, no.
Not currently. Okay. All right.
No, people
Good
are
to know.
doing some work in, other parts of the Arctic sampling like common eiders and looking at some different types of contaminants, and people have done all sorts of different contaminant studies over the years, but the POPs, what type of chemicals? I'm not super familiar with those, but there are some current contaminant studies going on in the Eastern Canadian Arctic.
Okay. Well, when you guys come back and talk to us again, maybe you can be kind of a little bit loaded on the side with a paper or something like that to if that question comes up, that would be awesome.
I couldn't help myself, and I just Google scholared that topic, and there's several recent interesting papers. That one is Mercury and
Drop it in.
I think it was eiders in the central Canadian Arctic, and then there's two other recent papers that they don't say exactly what the toxin, the pollutant was.
Could you just drop the link if you don't have time to download?
I'll try.
Me
Yeah,
to
try.
load up at their end. Hard also for our remote communities to have access to papers and stuff. So that'd be awesome. With that, you guys have done a superb job. What happens next? Are you guys coming back and going to fly? I know you say you're working on improving your surveys. You probably can't tell us the secrets on how you're going to do that, but are you coming back on anytime soon to try them out, your new survey ideas or survey techniques?
Well, Eric's applying them now to the data we have in hand.
Okay.
And we don't have any plans for a winter survey in the near future. It's a pretty involved effort, that requires putting out satellite transmitters, and we
Okay.
don't have plans for that right now.
All right. Well, thank you for all my questions. And I think with that, any other questions? I think you guys have done, we're so grateful. We're going to stay on here for a sec so Erik can drop those links for opicondiamide about persistent or whatever contaminants he just found about. So thank you, Erik, if you can zap those links if you can't get the papers. Oh, he's actually putting the
I got
papers
one
in.
on there, but there's another one that looks even more interesting. So
Oh, shoot the link. We won't keep you guys on, but Erik, that's brilliant because it's very hard for us. All right. Thank you, Lainey. Very good. There's two OPICs. One is Lainey. So thank you, Lainey. Have a good night, Lainey. Go to bed.
Appreciate you guys inviting us to talk, and it's great to have the opportunity to be able to, do work in the region and be able to connect with people and let them know what's going on. And obviously, we're continue to finish these analyses, but we'll make sure to share once we get final products and stuff. Share them with you guys.
Awesome. With that, if Dan, Erik, Dave, if you guys want to stay on for just 1 or 2 seconds more before I cut you loose, and I hope you guys take off. Don't even go to work until noon tomorrow. We will let all the nice people head for bed. So first, thank you so much all for coming. We thank our speakers greatly. And next week, there will be no Straight Science, but on the 12th, the USGS from California, of all places, is going to tell us about the coastal cameras they have not only along the state, but specifically in the Bering Strait region, and how they're using these remote cameras, not to spy on us, but to look at, keep track of change. And they're going to give us some results and where the cameras are and all that. So it should be pretty interesting and very Bering Strait focused. And thank you so much, all of you, on top of speaking, but providing the papers to those of us in the remote rural ends of things here on both sides of the Bering Strait. We really appreciate that opportunity. That was a bonus there. And we say Bolshoi Spasiba for Magadan taking the time. I have no idea what the time zone is, but they're already in tomorrow's weather. Taking the time to join us tonight. So thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks.
And we'll see
Thanks
you
a
next
lot.
time. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time. Take care, everybody. Have a good night.